Live from the BDN Studios, it's Bang and Dang.
That's awesome.
If you don't like that, then
You ain't black.
Welcome back to the Battles of the American Civil War with your host, Bang and Dang. Continuing on the old Red River campaign here. And a bunch of nothings for the Union. Union's getting smoked. And not only are they getting smoked, they're getting massacred. Because we also have the Fort Pillow battle, but also known as the Fort Pillow Massacre.
Oh, wow.
In which, the Union were hot about this one after it happened, and a bunch of news stories covering it like it was modern day scandals. So, yeah, some Battle of Pleasant Hill, though, up first in the Red River campaign. And obviously that Fort Pillow. Before we get into it, go check out our YouTube at Bang Dang Network. Clips, shorts, full episodes, YouTube exclusive Dart League. And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple, give us a review and comment on the Spotify Battle of Pleasant Hill starting out first, April 9th, 1864. Obviously, like we said, part of the Red River campaign, which Union forces were aiming to occupy the Louisiana state capital of Shreveport, well, the Confederate state capital anyways. After the success of the Confederates at the Battle of Mansfield, which we just covered last episode, Union forces retreated during the night and next morning took up a position on Pleasant Hill. The road from Mansfield to Pleasant Hill was littered by burning wagons, abandoned knapsacks, arms, and cooking utensils. Federal stragglers and wounded were met by the hundreds and were quickly rounded up and sent to the rear, explains historian John D. Winters. Oh, fuck him.
Into the rear, huh? Into the rear.
So they're taking all these guys prisoner.
Battle of Mansfield took place about 3 miles southeast of town of Mansfield at Sabine Cross Roads. Pleasant Hill was located about 16 miles southeast of Sabine Cross Roads. The old rebel reinforcements had arrived late on the 8th of April, 1864. Major General Thomas Churchill's Arkansas Division arrived at Mansfield about 3:30 p.m. And Brigadier General Mosby Parsons' Missouri Division, which had about 2,200 men, they arrived at about 6 p.m. at Mansfield, ready to roll. Put me in, coach.
Right, we're ready to shoot. Neither of these divisions participated in the Battle of Mansfield. However, both would play a major role during this present Battle of Pleasant Hill. On the Union side, reinforcements also arrived when Major General Andrew J. Smith commanded detachments of the 16th and 17th Corps arrived from Grand E Corps late on April 8th around nightfall and encamped about 2 miles from Pleasant Hill.
Oh. Well, all right.
Good for them.
Yeah, that worked out quite well. Morning of 9th of April, Major General William Franklin ordered the baggage train to proceed to Grand E Corps. It left Pleasant Hill about 11 a.m., included many pieces of artillery. Most of Franklin's cavalry, commanded by Brigadier General Elbert Lindley Lee, and the 13th Corps, they left with it. This included the Corps d'Afrique, commanded by Colonel William Dickey, which was wounded on the 8th of April, and Brigadier General Thomas Ransom's detachment of the 13th Corps, now under the command of Brigadier General Robert Cameron. Ransom was also wounded on the 8th of April.
Sure was. Well, this baggage train made slow progress and was still only a few miles from Pleasant Hill when the major fighting began later that day. Brigadier General Charles P. Stone and others attempted to get Cameron to return to Pleasant Hill throughout the day, but he failed to do so. He stated that he never received any written orders to return.
Oh.
They need your supplies, bud.
Right.
Major General Nathaniel P. Banks doesn't appear to have been fully aware of the exact orders Cameron had received from Franklin.
Oh, jeez.
Well, of course not.
Why would he?
Right, why would they even be aware of what's going on? The Union side lost 18 pieces of artillery at the Battle of Mansfield. They did. They lost and horses.
They did. These were, in turn, on the Union forces the next day at Pleasant Valley. They're like, watch this.
Oh, Valley, sure.
Like, we're going to use your own guns on you. The old Reb.
Pleasant Hill.
All right, Rebadier. The old rebel Brigadier General Jean-Jacques Alexandre Alfred Mouton. He was moited during the Battle of Mansfield. That was 8th of April, 1864. Brigadier General Camille J. de Polignac commanded Mouton's forces at Pleasant Hill. Confederate Trans-Mississippi Department Commander Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith. He was at Shreveport. He received a dispatch from Major General Richard Taylor that reached him about 4 a.m. on the 9th of April. It informed him of the battle at Mansfield. Smith then rode 45 miles to Pleasant Hill, but did not reach there in time for the battle, arriving around nightfall.
Among the Union regiments fighting at Pleasant Hill on April 9th was the 47th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment, part of the 2nd Brigade in Emory's 19th Corps. The 47th Pennsylvania was the only regiment from Keystone State to fight in the Union's Red River Campaign.
Really?
Led by Colonel Tillman H. Good, the 47th Pennsylvania sustained a significant number of casualties, including several men who were captured by Confederate troops.
All right.
Not good for them.
Right. Held initially at Pleasant Hill, prisoner of wars from the 47th Pennsylvania and the other Union regiments, they were marched and moved by rail to the largest CSA prison west of the Mississippi, which is Camp Ford, which was situated near Tyler, Texas. Other members of 47th ended up at Camp Gross near Hempstead, Texas, and or the Confederate Hospital in Shreveport.
All right, Miss Dalton. 1864, Pleasant Hill was a small village. Now we're going to learn about the village, guys. Pleasant Hill was a small village situated about 2 miles north of the current village of Pleasant Hill. Really? A new village that later grew up nearby in order to be closer to the railroad, and that took the same name after the old village was abandoned. Okay, the site of the old village is today referred to as the Old Town or Old Pleasant Hill. Is it still occupied?
I'm sure there's some people there.
Dr. Harris H. Beecher, assistant surgeon of the 114th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment, who was present at the battle, described the village of Pleasant Hill as a town about 12 or 15 houses situated on a clearing in the woods of a mile or so in extent and elevated a trifle above the general level of the surrounding country. Huh. Damn, so why are they even here?
Right. Cray. 1864, the countryside in this part of Louisiana mostly consisted of pine forests and scrub oaks. That's what, according to Banks. The shortest and only practicable road from Natchitoches to Shreveport was the stage road from Pleasant Hill and Mansfield, which is about 100 miles, through a barren, sandy country with less water and less forage, the greater portion an unbroken pine forest. A newspaper described Pleasant Hill as a little village situated on a low ridge, containing in peace times probably 300 inhabitants.
Little guy. It also further stated in that newspaper, the battlefield of Pleasant Hill is a large open field which had once been cultivated, but is now overgrown with weeds and bushes. The slightly elevated center of the field, from which the name Pleasant Hill is taken, is nothing more than a long mound hardly worth the name of a hill.
Oh. All right.
Semicircular belt of timber runs around the field on the Shreveport side. So big nothing.
Jeez, guy, you don't have to make fun of it, man.
Right.
That's not a hill.
That's not a hill. Puny little mound.
Right. Pleasant Mound. Historian John Winters, he describes Pleasant Hill as a piney woods summer resort consisting of a dozen or more houses clustered along a cleared knoll, offered Banks by many advantages as a battlefield. But because of the great distance from the main supply base at Alexandria and the serious lack of sufficient drinking water for an entire army, Banks could not hold this position for any length of time. During the one day, April 9th, most of the rainwater stored in the cisterns were depleted. Without making a final decision concerning the future of this campaign, Banks sent his wagon trains on the way toward Grand Ecore.
You sure did. 5 p.m., the Confederate forces launched their attack, charging the entire Union line. Major General John G. Walker's and Brigadier General James Major's attack on the Union right had little success. The Union right, for the most part, held its ground. However, overall, this initial charge by the Confederates was highly successful, and many of the positions down the Union left and center were overrun by Churchill's and Parsons' forces, and the Union positions were forced backwards. However, again, the Union side succeeded in halting the advance and regained the left and center ground before driving the Confederates from the field.
Oh, shit.
Look at that.
Look at that. The fiercely fought battle lasted about 2 hours. Losses were heavy on both sides. 32nd Iowa Infantry sustained especially heavy casualties as it was cut off from the rest of the Union forces during the battle. Confederate Brigadier General Hamilton P.B., with 2 regiments in columns of 4, they rode swiftly down the Pleasant Hill Road. I'm going down the Pleasant Hill Road. I'm going to ride toward the enemy lines. They went down swiftly the Pleasant Hill Road toward enemy lines. The old Rebs' forces were suddenly attacked at close range by Federales concealed behind a fence.
Historian Winters describes the scene accordingly. Men toppled from their saddles, wounded horses screamed in anguish, and, for a moment, pandemonium reigned. Bees' men took temporary shelter in a series of small ravines studded with young pines until they recovered from the shock of the unexpected attack. B rallied his men, but in the process had 2 horses shot from under him.
Oh, damn.
Colonel Xavier B. Debray was injured when he fell from the saddle of his dead horse. Debray was able to withdraw his men safely to the rear, leaving, however, about a third of them killed or wounded on the front.
Dang.
He said, I'm gone, though.
Banks, his army, they began their retreat from Pleasant Hill about 1 a.m. on the morning of the 10th of April, just a few hours after the battle had ended. According to Brigadier General Hamilton P.B., riding from his headquarters at Pleasant Hill on the 10th of April, he was in possession of the battlefield at Pleasant Hill at daylight on the morning of 10th of April. And he wrote that the day has been passed in burying the dead of both armies and caring for the federal wounded. Our own wounded have been cared for throughout the night.
Well, a number of Union soldiers were captured during the battle, and many more at the Battle of Mansfield. A lot, yeah. And were taken to Camp Ford, which we described already. Most were kept prisoner here for the next year or so and were not released until a general exchange of prisoners occurred near the end of the war.
Wow.
A small number, however, were released at an earlier date.
Okay.
After the battle, Banks and his Union forces retreated to Grand Ecourt and abandoned plans to capture Shreveport. By then, which they're like, yeah, this little Shreveport thing is not working out for us, guys.
No. Some of the wounded, perhaps 30 in number, from both Pleasant Hill and Mansfield, they were taken to Minden for treatment. Those who died of their wounds there were interred without markers in the historic Minden Cemetery. They were finally recognized with markers erected on the 25th of March, 2008, by the Sons of the Confederate Veterans.
Okay. The historian Ludwell Johnson refers to the battle as a Union tactical victory, which the majority of historians agree happened as well, although a few consider the action to have been a draw.
Right.
The decisive failure of the Red River Campaign was a rare bit of uplifting news for the Confederacy in a bleak year.
It was.
Despite the loss of resources, the failure of this offensive helped to prolong the war by tying down Union resources from other fronts, right? And drawing out a needless war that you guys are already lost.
Right. And give them a little bit of hope with these little puny victories here and there.
Right.
Moving on. That was the old Pleasant Hill. Battle of Fort Pillow, also known as the Fort Pillow Massacre. This was founded on the April 12th, 1864 at Fort Pillow on the old Mississippi River in Henning, Tennessee, there in the old Civil War.
In perfect Tennessee.
All right. The battle ended with the old Rebs, commanded by Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest, massacring United States Army soldiers, many of them African Americans. They were trying to surrender. They're like, hey, man, we're done. I'm like, nope.
Thought so.
United States deployment of the United States colored troops, combined with Abraham Lincoln's issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, profoundly angered the old Rebs, who called it uncivilized. In response, the old Rebs in May of 1863 passed a law stating that black U.S. soldiers captured while fighting against the old rebels will be turned over to the state, where the captured would be tried according to state laws.
Probably moited. Well, Fort Pillow was built in early 1862 by Gideon Johnson Pillow, who was a Confederate brigadier general on the Mississippi River 40 miles north of Memphis. Was used by both sides during the war, clearly. Right. With the fall of New Madrid and Island No. 10 to U.S. Army forces, Confederate troops evacuated Fort Pillow on June 4th to avoid being cut off from the rest of the Confederate Army. That was 1862, right? Yeah. U.S. Army forces occupied Fort Pillow on June 6th and used it to protect the river approach to Memphis. The fort stood on a high bluff and was protected by 3 lines of entrenchments arranged in a semicircle with protective parapet 4 feet thick, 6 to 8 feet high, surrounded by a ditch.
Perfect. How the hell the Rebs not... well, they had it abandoned. They weren't...
Right.
So bad. During this battle, though, this design was a disadvantage to the defenders because they could not fire upon approaching troops without mounting the top of the parapet, which subjected them to enemy fire. Because of the width of the parapet, operators of the 6 artillery pieces of the fort found it very difficult to depress their barrels enough to fire on the attackers once they got close. United States Navy gunboat USS New Era, commanded by Captain James Marshall, was also available for the defense. Cool. 16th of March, year 1864. Major General
General, Major General.
Confederate Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest, he launched a month-long cavalry raid with 7,000 troopers into West Tennessee and Kentucky.
Yep. Their objectives were to capture U.S. prisoners and supplies and to demolish posts and fortifications from Paducah, Kentucky, south to Memphis. Forrest's Cavalry Corps, which he called the Cavalry Department of West Tennessee and North Mississippi, original, consisted of the divisions led by Brigadier Generals James R. Chalmers, who had the brigades of Brigadier General Robert V. Richardson and Colonel Robert McCulloch, and then General A. Buford had the brigades of Colonels Tyree Bell and A.P. Thompson.
Awesome, Buford, huh? Wasn't there a Buford in the north?
I think so.
The first of the two significant engagements in the expedition was the Battle of Paducah on the 25th of March, where Forrest's men did considerable damage to the town and its military supplies. Forrest had tried to bluff United States Colonel Stephen G. Hicks into surrender, and he was warning them, "If I have to storm your works, you may expect no quarter." Hicks rejected, as he knew that the fort could not be easily taken.
And it wasn't.
Right. Numerous skirmishes occurred throughout the region in late March and early April. Needing supplies, Forrest planned to move on Fort Pillow with about 1,500 to 2,500 men. He also had a detached part of his command under Buford to strike Paducah again.
Yeah, well, they didn't strike it. They just went and stole all those fine horses that were left, remember? Right. He also wrote, April 4th, there is a federal force of 500 or 600 at Fort Pillow, which I shall intend to in a day or two, as they have horses and supplies which we need. The U.S. Army garrison at Fort Pillow consisted of about 600 men, divided almost evenly between black and white troops. The black soldiers belonged to the 6th U.S. Regiment Colored Heavy Artillery and a section of the 2nd Colored Light Artillery, previously known as the Memphis Battery Light Artillery, of African descent, under the overall command of Major Lionel F. Booth, who had been in the fort for only 2 weeks.
Booth had been ordered to move his regiment from Memphis to Fort Pillow, 28th of March, to augment the cavalry, who had occupied the fort several weeks earlier. Many of the regiment were formerly enslaved people who understood the personal cost of a loss to the old rebs, at best, an immediate return to slavery rather than being treated as a prisoner of war.
Right. And that was at best.
Right. Think you want to be a slave than a prisoner of war? I don't know. All depends on how they treated their prisoners of war. They had heard that some Confederates threatened to kill any black United States Army trooper that they encountered. The white soldiers were predominantly recruits from Bradford's battalion, a United States Army unit from West Tennessee commanded by Major William F. Bradford.
You think? Well, Forrest arrived at Fort Pillow 10 a.m., April 12th. By this time, Chalmers had already surrounded the fort. A stray bullet struck Forrest's horse, fell in the general, and bruising him. This was the first of 3 horses he lost that day. He deployed sharpshooters around the higher ground that overlooked the fort, bringing many occupants into their direct line of fire. Sharpshooter's bullet to the chest killed Major Booth, and Bradford assumed command. By 11 a.m., the Confederates had captured 2 rows of barracks about 150 yards from the southern end of the fort. Unfortunately, the U.S. Army soldiers had failed to destroy these buildings before the Confederates occupied them, they subjected the garrison to a murderous fire.
Oh, no.
Come on, why would you not destroy them?
Right. Rifle and artillery fire continued until about 3:30 p.m. when Forrest sent a note demanding surrender. The note read, "The conduct of the officers and men garrisoning Fort Pillow has been such as to entitle them to being treated as prisoners of war. I demand the unconditional surrender of the entire garrison, promising that you shall be treated as prisoners of war. My men have just received a fresh supply of ammo and, from their present position, can easily assault and capture the fort. Should my demand be refused, I cannot be responsible for the fate of your command." Bradford replied, concealing his identity as he did not wish the Confederates to realize that Booth had been moited, requesting an hour for consideration.
So give me an hour to think about it.
Right.
Well, Forrest, who believed that reinforcing troops would soon arrive by a river, replied that he would only allow 20 minutes, and that if the expiration of that time the fort is not surrendered, I shall assault it. Bradford refused this opportunity with a final reply. He says, "I will not surrender."
Oh, shit.
Forrest then ordered his bugler to sound the charge.
So is it a massacre? He didn't surrender?
The Confederate assault was furious. While the sharpshooters maintained their fire into the fort, the first wave entered the ditch and stood while the second wave used their backs as stepping stones.
Oh, wow. These men's These men then reached down and helped the first wave scramble up a ledge on the embankment. This proceeded flawlessly, and finally, you guys got something working out for you. And then with very little firing, except for sharpshooters around the flanks, so no ammo wasted, and they're gaining ground.
Right.
Their fire against the new air caused the sailors to button up their gun ports and hold their fire. As the sharpshooters were signaled to hold their fire, the men on the ledge went up and over the embankment, firing now for the first time into the massed defenders.
Wow. The garrison fought briefly, but then broke and ran to the landing at the foot of the bluff, where they had been told that the U.S. Navy gunboat would cover their withdrawal by firing grape shot and canister rounds.
Okay.
Because its gun ports remained sealed, the gunboat did not fire a single shot.
Wow.
The fleeing soldiers were subjected to fire from the rear and the flank.
Oh, wow.
Many were shot down. Others reached the river only to drown or be picked off in the water by sharpshooters on the bluff.
Although Confederate sources say that Forrest's forces kept firing in self-defense, official United States reports emphasize that a deliberate massacre occurred. United States Army survivors said that even though all the troops surrendered, Forrest's men massacred some in cold blood. Surviving members of the garrison said that most of the men surrendered and threw down their arms, only to be shot or bayoneted by the attackers, who repeatedly shouted, "No quarter, no quarter." I mean, you guys were warned. It was reported that women and children were murdered as well, but this was disputed by Dr. C. Fitch, who was a sergeant of the Fort Pillow garrison. Okay. In the early morning, all of the women and all of the non-combatants were ordered on some barges and were towed by a gunboat up the river to an island before anyone was hurt. So, yeah, look at you guys.
The testimony of Captain Marshall also supports this. He stated that all the women, children, and sick soldiers were removed to an island before the battle started. Strongest evidence that the Confederates did not kill the women and children is that no one reported seeing the bodies of women and children among the slain.
I mean, that's a pretty good.
That's pretty good stuff.
Right. I don't think there are any women and children here.
All right, why is that? Well, I didn't see any women or children.
No.
The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War immediately investigated the incident, which was widely publicized in the U.S. press. Stories appeared April 16th in the New York Times, New York Herald, New York Tribune. How many papers does New York need?
Right.
The Chicago Tribune, Cincinnati Gazette, and the St. Louis, Missouri Democrat, based on telegraph reports from Cairo, Illinois, where the steamer Platte Valley carrying survivors had called so that they could be taken to a hospital in nearby Mound City, Illinois. Oh, and also that those who had expired on the ship could be buried.
In the report from which the previous quotes were taken, they concluded that the Confederates shot most of the garrison after it had surrendered. A letter from one of Forrest's sergeants, Achilles V. Clark, writing his sisters on April 14th, reads in part, "Our men were so exasperated by the Yankees' threats of no quarter that they gave but little. The slaughter was awful. Words cannot describe the scene. The poor deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall on their knees, and with uplifted hands scream for mercy, but they were ordered to their feet and then shot down. The white men fared but little better. The fort turned out to be a great slaughter pen. Blood, human blood, stood in about pools, and brains could have been gathered up in any quantity. I, with several others, tried to stop the butchery, and at one time had partially succeeded, but General Forrest ordered them to shoot down like dogs, and the carnage continued. Finally, our men became sick of blood, and the firing ceased." Damn.
A 2002 study by Albert Castle concluded that Forrest's troops had killed a large number of the garrison after they had either ceased resisting or were incapable of resistance.
I mean, he gave him a warning, said, I cannot.
Doesn't matter. You just don't go murder people when they're surrendering.
He said it.
Stupid.
He had a chance to surrender, and if you don't, I can't tell you what's going to happen.
Okay, still dumb. Clearly, that guy, I don't know what happens to Forrest, but definitely should be tried for war crimes after this. Mm-hmm. Historian Andrew Ward in 2005 concluded that an atrocity in the modern sense occurred at Fort Pillow, but that the event was not premeditated nor officially sanctioned by Confederate commanders. Recent histories concur that a massacre occurred. Historian Richard Fuchs, the author of An Unerring Fire, concludes that the affair at Fort Pillow was simply an orgy of death, a mass lynching to satisfy the basis of conduct, intentional murder for the vilest of reasons, racism and personal enmity. Enmity.
Wow. Ward, he states, whether the massacre was premeditated, Whether the massacre was premeditated or spontaneous does not address the more fundamental question of whether a massacre took place. It certainly did, in every dictionary sense of the word. John Simprich, he states, the new paradigm in social altitudes and the fuller use of available evidence was favored a massacre interpretation. Debate over the memory of this incident formed a part of the sectional and racial conflicts for many years after this war. But the reinterpretation of the event during the last 30 years offers some hope that society can move beyond past intolerance. You think so?
Lieutenant Daniel Van Horn of the 6th U.S. Heavy Artillery, which was a colored unit, stated in his official report, there never was a surrender at the fort. Both officers and men declaring they would never surrender or ask for quarter. Another unit officer, however, and the only surviving officer of Bradford's battalion, attested to the characterization that unarmed soldiers were in fact killed in the act of surrendering.
Right, but as a whole, they didn't surrender. That's what he's saying.
Doesn't matter.
Right. When
you got men that are coming up with your hands held and dropping their weapons and you shoot them, then something's wrong with that.
Yeah, you think so. Forrest's men, they insisted that the United States soldiers, although fleeing, kept their weapons and frequently turned to shoot, forcing the old Rebs to keep firing in self-defense. Their claim is consistent with the discovery of numerous United States Army rifles on the bluffs near the river. The United States flag was still flying over the fort, which indicated that the force had not formally surrendered. A contemporary newspaper account from Jackson, Tennessee, states that General Forrest begged them to surrender, but not the first sign of surrender was ever given. Similar accounts were reported in both southern and northern newspapers at this very time. Historian Alan Nevins, he wrote that although the interpretation of the facts had provoked some disputation.
Northerners, however, only saw one side. They read headlines announcing attack on Fort Pillow, indiscriminate slaughter of the prisoners, shocking scenes of savagery. Dispatches from Sherman's army declaring that there is a general gritting of teeth here. Reports from the Missouri Democrat detailing the fiendish of rebel behavior, and editorials like that in the Chicago Tribune condemning the murder and butchery. Okay, so of course the North is going to be all over it.
Right. The old New York Times, they wrote on the 24th of April, the blacks and their officers were shot down, bayoneted, and put to the sword in cold blood. Out of 400 Negro soldiers, only about 20 survived. At least 300 of them were destroyed after the surrender.
Damn.
This is the statement of the rebel General Chalmers himself to our informant.
That's what he says, huh?
Right. Forrest's dispatch stated, a demand was made for the surrender, which was refused. The victory was complete, and the loss of the enemy will never be known from the fact that large numbers ran into the river and were shot and drowned.
So he just admitted it.
Right. The force was composed of about 500 Negroes and 200 white soldiers, Tennessee Tories. The river was dyed with the blood of the slaughtered for about 200 yards. There was in the fort a large number of citizens who had fled there to escape the conscript law. Most of these ran into the river and were drowned. The approximate loss was upward to 500 moited, but few of the officers escaping. It is hoped that these facts will demonstrate to the northern people that Negro soldiers cannot cope with Southerners.
Oh, jeez.
All right.
Well, General Ulysses S. Grant quoted Forrest's dispatch in his personal memoirs and commented, subsequently, Forrest made a report in which he left out the part which shocks humanity to read. Right. John Fisher, in his book They Rode with Forrest and Wheeler, wrote, Grant refers here to two reports from Forrest to a superior officer who was Leonidas Polk. Number one, a hasty, exuberant report dated April 15, 1864, dashed off 3 days after the attack, describing the success of Forrest's recent operations in West Tennessee. And number two, a well-defined, detailed, and comprehensive report of action at Fort Pillow, only dated April 26. Okay. So he's saying that he leaves out what actually happened in his reports? Clearly he would.
Right. At the time of the massacre, General Grant was no longer in Tennessee, having transferred to the east to command all of the United States Army troops. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, commander of the military division of the Mississippi, which included Tennessee, he wrote this. The massacre at Fort Pillow occurred April 12, 1864, and has been the subject of congressional inquiry. No doubt Forrest's men acted like a set of barbarians shooting down the helpless Nago garrison after the fort was in their possession. But I'm told that Forrest personally disclaims any active participation in the assault, and that he stopped the firing as soon as he could. I also take it for granted that Forrest did not lead the assault in person, and consequently that he was to the rear, out of sight, if not of hearing at the time. And I was told by hundreds of our men who were at the various times prisoners in Forrest's possession that he was usually very kind to them. He had a white man, right? He had a desperate set of fellows under him, and at that very time, there's no doubt the feeling of the Southern people was fearfully savage on this very point of our making soldiers out of their late slaves. And Forrest may have shared that feeling.
I bet he did.
Like, you guys got these mofos out here that was just plowing my field.
Right, and now they're plowing our men. Casualty figures vary according to the source. They always do. 1908, Dyer, whoever that is, gave the following statistics of U.S. Army casualties. 350 killed, mortally wounded. 60 wounded, 164 captured and missing, 574 altogether. Confederate casualties were comparatively low, 14 killed and 86 wounded. And U.S. casualties were high. No shit.
Right.
Of the 585 to 605 U.S. men present, 277 to 297 were reported as dead.
Historians, they agree that defenders' casualties vary considerably according to race. Only about 58, around 20% black soldiers were taken prisoner, whereas 168, which is 60%, white soldiers were taken prisoner. Not all the prisoners who were shot were black. Major Bradford was apparently among those shot after surrendering.
Oh, wow.
Wasn't he shot on the...
That was Booth.
Right. The Rebs evacuated Fort Pillow that very evening and gained little from the battle, except causing a temporary disruption to United States Army operation. United States forces used the Fort Pillow massacre as a rallying cry in the following months. For many, it strengthened their resolve to see the war to its conclusion.
Yeah, piss them off, huh? April 17th, 1864, in the aftermath of Fort Pillow, General Grant ordered General Benjamin Butler, who was negotiating prisoner exchanges with the Confederacy, to demand that black shoulders...
Black shoulders be rubbed.
To demand that black soldiers be treated identically to whites in the exchange and treatment of prisoners. He directed that a failure to do so would be regarded as a refusal on their part to agree to further exchange of prisoners and would so be treated by us.
All right. Well, this demand was refused. Confederate Secretary of War James Sedan in June of 1864 wrote, "I doubt, however, whether the exchange of Negroes at all for our soldiers would be tolerated. As to the white officers serving with Negro troops, we ought never to be inconvenienced with such prisoners."
Wow.
The United States already had established a policy to discourage killing and enslaving prisoners of war.
I bet. July 30th, 1863, before the massacre, President Abraham Lincoln wrote his order of retaliation. This is before the massacre.
Right.
So it is therefore ordered that every soldier of the United States killed in violation of the laws of war, a rebel soldier, shall be executed. And for everyone enslaved by the enemy or sold into slavery, a rebel soldier shall be placed at hard labor on the public works and continued at such labor until the other shall be released and receive the treatment due to a prisoner of war.
Oh. No turning another cheek here, huh?
Right.
This policy did not lead to any action, but the threat of the action led the old Reb Army to treat the black U.S. soldiers as legitimate soldiers rather than formerly enslaved people for the remainder of the war. Nevertheless, the same merciless behavior was exhibited by Southern troops after the Battle of Crater in July of 1864, which we will get to, where the surrendering of black United States soldiers were shot rather than taken prisoner.
May 3rd, 1864, Lincoln asked his cabinet for opinions on how the United States should respond to this massacre. Secretary of the Treasury Solomon P. Chase recommended for Lincoln to enforce his order of retaliation
Right.
Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles wanted to wait for the Congressional Committee to obtain more information. Welles expressed concern in his diary. He said, "There must be something in these terrible reports, but I distrust congressional committees. They exaggerate."
Yeah.
All right.
Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and Attorney General Edward Bates wanted to retaliate. Secretary of Interior John Usher, he wrote that it was inexpedient to take any extreme action and wanted the officers of the forces command to be held responsible, though. Postmaster General Montgomery Blair wanted the actual offenders given the most summary punishment when captured. The actual ones that did it, right? Can't just...
Right.
Blair cited page 445 of the Book of International Law, or Rules of Regulating the Intercourse of States in Peace and War, written by Henry Halleck, the United States Chief of Staff, as justification for retaliation.
Oh, look at Halleck writing books and shit.
Right.
He's a chief of staff now?
He does.
Secretary of State William Seward wanted the Commanding General of the U.S. Army to confront the Commanding General of the Confederate Army about the allegations.
Right, why not?
Gideon Wells wrote of the cabinet meeting on May 6th. He said, Stanton fell in with my suggestion so far as to propose that, should Forrest or Chalmers or any other officers conspicuous in this butchery be captured, he should be turned over for trial for the murders at Fort Pillow.
Damn right.
I sat beside Chase and mentioned to him some of the advantages of this course, and he said it made a favorable impression. I urged him to say so, for it appeared that to me that the president and Seward did not appreciate it.
Oh.
Poor guy.
Well, Lincoln, he began to respond to Stanton, but took no subsequent action because he was distracted by other issues. Ultimately, Lincoln chose no action on the issue, as he sadly noted to Frederick Douglass. If once begun, there was no telling where retaliation would end. Lincoln further stated that the only victory would generally bring justice, as the perpetrators can only be effectively reached by successful prosecution of the war.
Right.
That's it.
Fort Pillow, preserved as the Fort Pillow State Historic Park, was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1974. The remains of the killed were moved to the Memphis National Cemetery in 1867. 109 of those graves have been identified. As the signage at the Fort Pillow site makes little reference to the black soldiers killed, a wreath-laying ceremony with color guard and 21-gun salute was held April 12, 2017 at the cemetery to commemorate them.
Fantastic. James Lockett, whoever that guy is, compared the Confederacy policy toward colored United States troops, no quarter, with the lynching and other violence against blacks after the war. All right, he compared what happened there after the war. In Southern minds, according to this writer, just as formerly enslaved people could not be voters or hold offices, they could not be soldiers either, and thus were not treated at Fort Pillow and elsewhere as surrendering soldiers. They were runaway slaves.
They were just slaves.
Runaway slaves.
And even if they didn't run away, they lived in the North their whole time. They're now, all right, now they're slaves again, or murdered.
Right.
Either or. Yep. It was the old massacre. Confederates are some dirty fuckers, aren't they? Well, coming up next week, we have the Battle of Blair's Landing in Louisiana, which is part of the Red River Campaign. Again, we'll also have the Battle of Salyersville in Kentucky and probably the Battle of Plymouth in North Carolina.
Hey.
Which, season bees, baby. That's what we do here.
B's and C's.
B's and C's. Yeah, that'll probably be it. And, yep, that'll be it. Before we get on to Battle of the Wilderness, I think, is our first big battle of 1864.
That's going to be nice.
With that, go check out our YouTube, Bang Dang Network. All of our shows, every day they release on the podcast apps. They are released on YouTube the same day, as well as clips, shorts, and our YouTube exclusive Dart League. And Apple, Spotify, any other podcasts, give us a review. Share it with your friends, and we shall be back next week for a couple more battles on this Battle of the American Civil War. We are the Mother Michigan as we.
Bang, bang.